an earth shift, the new earth, 5D, the age of Aquarius, alien disclosure.
Even if it's not that day, that conjunction that there are sort of aliens or foreign entities that suddenly are making themselves known on the earth. Let me make it more blunt. People will have to turn to like their own local communities for solutions to things. This star is present in the birth charts of so many spiritual people and channelers, and actually
Ultra minds, ultra minds, ultra minds, ultra JK, ultra. Ultra minds, ultra minds, ultra minds, ultra JK, ultra.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ultra Minds with JK Ultra. I'm here today with my very first guest and dear friend, Evan Nathaniel Grimm, who is a renowned astrologer, has almost 1 million followers across his platforms. He's been featured in the New York Post, Elle Magazine, Vice, InStyle, E! News, The Economist, and many, many more. Thank you, Evan, for being here. I'm so excited to do this.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. It's a honor to be the first guest on the podcast. So, I was elated when I found out that I could be, sort of part of the inaugural episode. So yeah, it's great.
So I love your style of astrology. I am a big fan. We're also good friends. So, one of the things that I wanted to ask, and not to go over a bunch of topics that people talk about on every podcast, something that is of interest of people in this community is really this concept of like an earth shift, the new earth, 5D, the age of Aquarius, alien disclosure, all of these things that seem to be coming up or are prophesized to come up. So, first, a lot of these things are kind of alluding to 2029. So, can you tell us a little bit about what will be happening between 2029 and 2025 astrologically that could indicate some of these things, or maybe not indicate that it's coming?
Yeah. It's interesting that, all of these different timelines across different disciplines are converging in a way, like whether you look at it astrologically or you just tap into your intuition. Many sages have been pointing out that, there is a, transition coming. And I think that in terms of, the astrology to getting to 2029, well, first of all, when people always ask me, like, when are things going to ease up and get better? When is the headache and the nightmare end? People have various reasons to feel existential about things over the past few years. And I actually typically will tell them that, well, I am an honest astrologer. And so I'll tell them that, honestly, things look pretty great in 2032. And they're always like, did you mean 2032? Did you like spell it wrong or whatever? And I'm like, no, it's 2032. And I do feel like 2032 is also like a point where some interesting stuff happens that we can talk about today. But I think along the way, 2029 does show that there could be a lot of changes to the way we work with, the way we use energy, the way that we coexist with Mother Earth and nature. I do think that some of the prophecies of, let's say, Nostradamus, they are reflected in the astrological transits. And just before I kind of talk through some of those events, it's interesting that you mentioned 2029 as your sort of the timeline that you've been looking at, through your research, because even in the past few days, I've been talking about 2029. Unintentionally to this episode, actually, just sort of like, I did my own live show on Instagram, and I was like, I said something like, decades from now, people will ask you where you were January 2025, as well as March of 2029. And I was like, and people were like, why are you saying March 2029? And it was because I was just doing research on the Saturn-Pluto cycle that we're in right now, which is one of the cycles I want to talk about in terms of like key events and through the rest of the decade, because the Saturn-Pluto cycle began in January of 2020. So everybody remembers where they were January 2020, which was like 2 months before the NBA game was canceled, and the whole country was shut down after that. So January 2020 started the Saturn-Pluto cycle, which is a recurring cycle in astrology. It lasts anywhere from 33 to 38 years. And the Saturn-Pluto cycle deals with, among other things, just power dynamics at a societal scale. It deals with sometimes just the loss of a foundational element of our own lives or of society. It can also deal with just, it is that cycle of metaphorical death and rebirth just at the social scale. And obviously at the beginning of that cycle, we had the pandemic, we had the lockdowns, and there were tighter controls placed on society, which actually kind of fits with the sign that the conjunction happened in, which was Capricorn. And the sign of Capricorn deals with governments and structures and regulations and rules. But anyways, by the time we get to 2029, we're actually going to deal with one of the first major aspects in that cycle. So essentially in 2029, we're going to be 25% of the way essentially through the Saturn-Pluto cycle. So what's going to happen is Saturn's going to square Pluto. And, it's going to show tension between, I think, the tension between the powers that be and the collective, tension between our desire to barrel forward towards the future with all kinds of innovations and our ecological realities. And it's interesting when we talk about the ecology, because right now, like literally 3 days ago, or a few days ago, Saturn was semi-square to Pluto, which is halfway to that 2029 square. So like this podcast episode is basically a midpoint to 2029 in the scope of or in the perspective of that cycle. So when I look at 2029, and I'm just gonna, as I talk, my eyes are gonna wander because I'm looking at the software here, which has all my nifty, astrology aspects and transits on it. But if I was to look at the Saturn-Pluto square, it actually happens also in late 2028. But by the time we get into March of 2029, we have Pluto still in Aquarius like it is now. But then, like I said, we have Saturn in Taurus. Now, Aquarius deals with things like electricity and power. Also, with Aquarius, we think about, just technology, social media, the future, the collective. So with Pluto being in Aquarius for the next 2 decades, essentially, anytime Saturn and Pluto form like a kind of a tough aspect or a tense aspect, you do have to wonder if there is some kind of change in the way that we work with the grid, the power grid, electricity, how we access it. And with Saturn being in Taurus, I think it's actually going to highlight the sort of emergency that we're in, I think, with the way that or with the state of Mother Earth. I mean, I really feel like regardless of how someone feels about climate change, whether it's a cycle, natural cycle, or it's man-made, like, I mean, I personally believe that obviously we're pumping stuff into the atmosphere. Obviously it's going to affect the Earth. And, by that time, there's something about 2029 to me that just feels like, I mean, do or die might be a little bit extreme, but it does feel like suddenly there is a crisis point where we have to change the way we like work with the land. Because not only is Saturn in Taurus, which is a sign, by the way, Taurus, that deals with land. I mean, it literally just deals with bare feet on the ground kind of stuff. But Chiron, which is the minor planet associated with wounds and healing, is also in Taurus at that time. So when I see all of this combined together, I do think about, well, could there be a pole shift or something that wipes out access to power or electricity that forces us to kind of like get back in touch with like the natural elements? Or is it, with Taurus being money, is it an economic crisis where either AI has just displaced so many jobs, or there's a new currency that starts to dominate? I don't know if it would be Bitcoin, but I think that there could be some kind of currency shift. But 2029, is signifying that there is some kind of new Earth. We're like, however somebody conceives of it, whether it's a 5-dimensional conception or it is from the vantage point of a a scientist who just only believes in what can be whatever, like observed with typical tools, like there is no going back to the way that we used to deal with issues on the earth. Because I feel like the way we even like treat our land is not that respectful. Like the way we farm and mass produce food in the US, at least, it just doesn't feel sustainable to me. So, I think that's how I think about 2029. It does feel like there's, again, a different relationship to the earth, and hopefully a relationship to the earth where there's a positive feedback loop where the earth is helping people go through their own ascension process, actually, but like somehow in concert with technology. Like, because I'm not just an astrologer, I'm a psychic, obviously, as you know, and I kind of, I have this way of just channeling and tapping in as I look at transits. And when I look at that square from Pluto to Saturn in 2029, I basically see a kind of like a hands-free technological world where we're not like this on our phones all the time in this disjointed way. I could see how technology would be so sophisticated that at the very least, it would allow us to get back into a free form kind of connection with the earth. And with Aquarius, by the way, also being community, that sort of like stereotypical notion of a commune or a community or a retreat place or, or an organic community of some kind, like that vision can be realized in the near future, because as we were working through the Saturn-Pluto cycle, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to find a way out from under the thumb of this heavy-handed bureaucracy. Because, again, regardless of what somebody thinks about, the pandemic, it's like objectively true that, we were basically forced to stay inside our homes, regardless of the data, basically, which would have our intuition or any data, which would have said you could still go to the beach. Like outdoor transmission, blah blah blah, is not as high risk as people think. So, anyways, like either like we have to acknowledge that objectively, like that was very heavy handed. It sort of like reminds me of like when the New York City, I don't remember, was it De Blasio, when the New York mayor basically shut down New York for like a day and like said everyone has to stay inside, like even if you have like a essential job. And this was in like 2014 or something, in preparation for like a blizzard, and like the snowstorm was like 1/10 of the severity of what they expected. And I was like, did we really shut down society for that? And the obvious answer was, well, politicians are trying to like save themselves in case that they don't want to be responsible for deaths in any, like not even one death, right? But it doesn't really make sense either to shut down the infrastructure, because that creates risks of all kinds. And so that was like kind of like a weird harbinger, I think, in a way of like what we went through, which was, again, nobody wanted blood on their hands. Nobody wanted that sort of. And so from the political calculation standpoint, it's like, okay, that drives some of the decisions. But anyways, people, I think through the lens of that, the lockdown, and just through the lens of feeling like everything they do is regulated and controlled and judged, like however you want to frame it. I just think that Saturn-Pluto cycle is a final sort of, a final chapter in that old world model of like top-down hierarchy of like using fear to control, which is like a storyline that, you talk about a lot, I talk about a lot, other people we know talk about a lot. But it's never going to become cliche to say that fear is a vehicle for control. I mean, it is. And I think people just go along with that, or they forget that. So anyways, I feel like with Pluto being in Aquarius, just as an undercurrent to this whole discussion, because like Pluto's going to be in Aquarius until 2044, it is waking up the masses in different ways. Regardless of whether someone's like right or left or whatever political leanings, it doesn't matter, because like people on one side might look at at a president and be like, well, they're an autocrat or a plutocrat or whatever, and then on the other side, the same thing. So I think everybody's like fed up with the way things are run. And so I think that over the next few years, Pluto and Aquarius will continue to kind of like raise the temperature, not in a bad way, but like raise the temperature and kind of like it's just gonna like inspire people to, well, actually, let me make it more blunt. People will have to turn to like their own local communities for solutions to things, because we're going to see the infrastructure fail us, I think, in many ways, whether it's politically, in terms of power, the utility companies, whatever it is, like farming. We're going to find all kinds of reasons to come back into our local communities and localize and then reconnect with the earth, but still have the technology with Aquarius being social media and things like that to connect with who's out there in the same way that we're doing that, or in the same way that we're connecting now. So I think that that's it's like basically a multi-layered process. But in an ideal world, by 2029, there would be sort of a vacuum that's left behind by the powers that maybe are no longer efficacious. They're just basically like paper giants, and that the people are not necessarily like taking their place, hopefully, but like just deciding to, again, ascend, kind of get in touch with the earth while still just generating so many amazing ideas in collaboration with others globally. So it's kind of like it's an interesting, again, multi-layered effect. So I think that that's where things are going into 2029. But in terms of like marquee events leading up to 2029, there is a Saturn-Neptune conjunction from May of this year until February of 2026 in the sign of Aries. And Saturn, also, I've already talked about Saturn, I guess, but like, Saturn is, again, that planet that deals with hierarchies, regulation, rules, authorities, governments, companies, all the sort of like matrixy stuff, because, Saturn has a ring around it. And so like naturally Saturn deals with boundaries and limits. And Saturn is the black cube, and you even think about it in that sense, like there's a sense of like boundaries in that way with Saturn and whatnot. So Saturn is that solidity, and Neptune is not. I mean, Neptune just dissolves completely. It sort of dares us to think beyond our boundaries and beyond our either even borders. So when Saturn and Neptune last conjoined, which was in 1989, that's when the Berlin Wall fell, and that was a dissolving of a boundary. And so this upcoming conjunction, well, it's interesting, right? Because this year we are dealing with like all kinds of issues with immigration and issues with like border security, and like that's not just a U.S. thing; that's a lot of countries. But the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, I think, is it is speaking to also this notion that certain governing bodies are not as solid as they once were, or the sort of social standing of something is not the same as it once was, or the reputation of a certain position or office is no longer what it was. And Saturn Neptune can be other things. It can actually speak to changes in the healthcare industry, and it can actually bring about sometimes utopian movements, because there were major developments in sort of the whole like generation of like ideas around communism basically developed in line with this conjunction. So anyways, the Saturn Pluto conjunction, I think, could possibly over the next year generate some really interesting spiritual movements. I wouldn't be surprised by that, just because there's going to be a crisis in faith, and kind of like a lack of faith in the systems as they are, which again is I think something that's fairly evidenced at this point by just like general sentiment. And again, that's regardless of political leanings. I just feel like that's again, how, again, like there's just so much dysfunction. But I just want to like mention this: Saturn and Neptune combined in and around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution. So that's like, because again, these cycles recur, and the Bolshevik Revolution obviously was, it was literally like the catalyst for, for Russia to, basically establish this socialist government. And the Saturn Neptune conjunction, I think, can bring about revolution and changes to the system. So I don't know. I saw a news story about how like the California Secretary of State wants to put forth like a secession legislation by 2028. So, you know, exactly that. Like it's not far fetched to assume that there's a loss of trust in the system, because a system only has value if people trust in it. Like the dollar only has value if people trust that it's valuable. So I think we are experiencing that. Another transit that I want to talk about is the Uranus Pluto trine, which is happening over the course of many years, including this decade. But Uranus and Pluto are in this trine aspect, which is a trine is very positive and flowing. I think that the Uranus Pluto trine aspect is, bringing in this sort of innovative, exciting, almost like, I don't know. It's just very like experimental, actually. So it's kind of bringing in this technologic, but also experimental energy, which harkens back to its conjunction, which the exact date of the conjunction was in the mid 60s. And I don't have the exact date of the conjunction in front of me, but if I was to just like really quickly pull that up, it was 1966. Yeah. So June of 1966. And in the mid 60s, obviously, we had like, an explosion of like psychedelics and festivals, and the hippie movement was sort of and the Vietnam War protests, like that whole era was like so, and civil rights, like it was such a monumental era in American history. But anyways, we have the opening trine from that time happening in Gemini and Aquarius. That's where those planets will be. And I do think that that is probably the most closely connected to any kind of spiritual revolution that would happen, because the Saturn-Pluto square I talked about in 2029, to me, has a lot more to do with the disassembly or disassemblage of a system. And the Saturn-Neptune conjunction also sort of gives this sort of notion of like revolution or disintegration of a system, which is more so like just the nuts and bolts of it, right? Like that's just more like, okay, this doesn't function. And like Robert Phoenix, an astrologer I work with sometimes, and I've done some shows with him, like he talks about Trump as a Caesar like sort of leader, and it kind of has, I don't know, I just feel like we're in this sort of late stage something or other, right? And as systems start to like fall apart, that always happens, right? That happens every so often. And I think in this case, if we're talking about the new earth and actual like enlightenment, that is possible astrologically because of the Pluto Uranus trine. And with Pluto and Uranus trining each other, just to add in a little bit more detail about that.
And what is like the time frame? You say that there's the Saturn Neptune is kind of like the falling down, the dismantling of stuff.
Right.
Simultaneously, there's also this Uranus trine, which is happening, which is more like a spiritual evolution. And then also during the Pluto in Aquarius, these things all happening at the same time. So like, what is the time frame of this kind of falling down with Neptune Saturn and this kind of revolution building up spiritual with the Uranus trine?
Yeah. So in astrology, we always think about there's an exact aspect when it forms, like down to like we could like mark it down to the minute of time. And then we have like the orb of influence, which is basically like a range in which those planets are connected to each other. In the case of the Pluto Uranus trine, it actually sort of began late 2024, while Pluto was still, in the later degrees of Capricorn, and Uranus was in the later degrees of Taurus. But technically, the trine is exact on July 17th of 2026, November 29th of 2026, June 15th of 2027. Then it happens again, January 12th of 2028, May 2028. And that's just because the planets will retrograde at various times and then move forward again and catch up to each other. And these planets in particular, Uranus and Pluto, move very slowly. So Uranus has an 84-year orbit and Pluto has about a 248-year orbit. So
this could kind of happen in waves also, like groups of people uprising or things dismantling in groups.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, I feel like it will definitely give many people a chance to kind of hop on board, And one of the reasons I'm specifically hopeful about this trine, and not like feeling like it's any kind of ordinary aspect, because sometimes astrologers will be very gifted at exaggerating things, right? Saying that, like, this this new moon is going to be the biggest of your life, and it's like, maybe, but probably not. And there have been many astrologers who have said, well, the US's Pluto return, because it happens at this exact moment, that everything falls apart all at once. And like you said, the thing, it kind of ebbs and flows. But I think this trine is interesting and historic in a way, because it's happening also while Uranus reaches an alignment with the fixed star Aldebaran. And that I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit with another event this decade. But Aldebaran is a fixed star that I pay attention to very closely. I oftentimes actually have clients with that area of the sky activated in their chart, and it's around 9 degrees of Gemini, 10 degrees of Gemini. And this star is present in the birth charts of so many spiritual people and channelers, and actually writers as well. But people who can actually channel languages that are not here on Earth, or not like sort of officially formally recognized by, society. So, I mean, and if someone's listening to this podcast and they have like 9 to 10 degrees of Gemini or 9 to 10 degrees of Sagittarius in their chart, they should, maybe they can corroborate this. But a lot of people with these aspects, with that alignment, they have either the ability to speak like a light language, or some sort of channeled language that just they don't necessarily know what it is, but they're able to speak it, almost like a speaking in tongues type of thing. Anyways, Uranus is going to align with Aldebaran while it's still very much in a trine with Pluto. In actually, what year? 2028. And that trine, while it's still going on, and on Aldebaran there, I think even that moment in 2028, and I'm looking specifically at May and June of 2028 as a kind of a range, I think even around then, that trine could facilitate some really profound channeling experiences, where people are just downloading information that it was previously inaccessible. It's almost like people are hearing radio stations that they couldn't hear before, tapping into higher frequencies that they couldn't before. And even if it's not that time for some people, it could be the other times I mentioned already, or the trine is exact, or in the aftermath of 2028 even. But it's, the Pluto Uranus trine is going to compel people, I think, to think outside the box and think outside of the programming, right? And again, programming is a word that I hear a lot, and to a point where it's like, is this a cliche? But I go back to the fact that it's really not, because the programming is so embedded, right? Like this idea that that quantum physics has no connection to spirituality. Like there's still like pushback about that. Like people think that there is no connection, but we can kind of, like, spirituality teaches us that we can go into that area, that quantum, and kind of experience the vibration of something that we want, or something that, like the future can be here now kind of thing when we meditate, and, all of that. So I think that people will, whether it's by sheer cynicism that the actual system has broken, or it's just by hopefulness and evidence that some sort of meditation practice or spiritual practice is actually working for them and yielding results, whatever the mechanism is or the reason, I do think a lot more people will turn to these sort of, more intuitive based activities in communities where they can get validation for it. I think it's actually really important, because there are many millions of people out there who, let's say, watch one of your videos every week or watch one of my videos every week, but they don't like it or they don't follow us because they're worried about what their friends might think. And that's actually a thing. I mean, I've actually talked to somebody about that, and they mentioned that for many months they didn't even like my videos because they didn't want that. They didn't want that sort of association with astrology and my account. But for every, one of those people, there's millions of others, but they're not going to take a leap into the spiritual space without some community or social group that's going to make them feel less ostracized. And I think that's what like a TikTok type platform has done for people though recently in recent years, as it has validated the journey. But there's still a lot of work to do there. So I think as Pluto continues to go through the sign of Aquarius, there will be many, many reasons for people to turn to those communities, and those communities will have that type of, green light effect. And yeah, and then another one, I guess one other event I just want to highlight before we get to that, or as we're talking about, I guess this is question one. So as I answer this question in in 10 answers, I would say the transit that maybe keeps me up at night, but I think we can still experience it in a more positive way, is actually next spring, 2026. So I go on and I kind of harp on about this to a lot of people, but I don't always speak about it publicly because, it's like one of those things where I have to phrase it very delicately so that I'm not inspiring like panic in people or anything. And I don't want to do that either. But, April of 2026, is pretty messed up because what's happening is we have, for example, like April 17th, it's around that time, but like basically in April 15th, 16th time frame, 17th, we have this like Aries moon, Mercury, Neptune, Mars, Saturn, Chiron, and Sun. So all of those planets are in Aries. So I just listed how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7 like planet celestial bodies that we track in astrology. 7 major celestial bodies in the sign of Aries. And what does Aries represent? Aries represents war. Aries represents sort of this energy of like an attack, or, in other ways it's courage. It's not all bad, but it has a warlike sort of energy. And Saturn and Neptune in Aries combined, to me, speaks of sacrifice on behalf of a cause and sacrifice on the battlefield. So I've gone out on a limb many times and said that it wouldn't be impossible that there's a draft, a conscription in a country like the US. Now, is it the US? Is it another country? It kind of depends, but the US will also be experiencing its Uranus return, for example, around that time. And the Uranus return for the United States is interesting because, the last time, so 2 cycles ago when Uranus was in Gemini, actually, which is where the US's Gemini is, or sorry, the US's Uranus is, was the Civil War, by the way. So the US has been involved in some sort of skirmish while Uranus has been in Gemini. And Uranus was also in Gemini sort of at the tail end of World War II. So if I was to like go to 1945, Uranus is in Gemini solidly. So Uranus was in Gemini for much of World War II. But if we go back to like 1863 or something, Uranus in Gemini. So, when I think about 2026, especially April, when we get this Aries stellium and this lineup of Aries planets, plus Uranus sort of finally getting into Gemini, really, I mean, Uranus is kind of going all in on the sign of Gemini because it goes into Gemini briefly this year and then back into Taurus. But like by April of 2026, it's actually solidly in Gemini for like the rest of that cycle in Gemini. So anyways, when you add all this up with Mars also in its home sign of Aries, and I'll add one more thing, the North and South node squaring those 2 fixed stars I talked about a few minutes ago, Aldebaran and Antares, which are not only fixed stars that I've noticed in the charts of star seeds, but they are the stars that are associated with the Crusades and the religious wars. So anytime there's some kind of like nodal square, and then lunar nodes deal with fate and karma and dharma and like potential, like kind of it's this bridge between the past and the future. Anytime I see those planets, or sorry, those nodes on, around that area of like 7, 8, 9 degrees of the mutable signs, I'm like, I don't know. I feel like it's a little bit daunting. And like 9/11 happened while Pluto and Saturn were opposing each other. So speaking about the Saturn-Pluto cycle again, they were opposing each other near those fixed stars. And that kicked off a religious sort of war, right? So that's also just a quick reminder that the Saturn-Pluto cycle is kind of a cycle of destruction in some ways. I mean, the Saturn-Pluto cycle can actually align with like pandemics even, which obviously it did, and like in the early 80s when those two planets were last lined up before the 2021. That was the AIDS crisis. So, we see destructive events in the world. And so I think it's interesting that 2029 features that square, because that can be a destruction of its own in the old Earth, right? So it's like if we have this sort of Earth split, it could feel destructive for some, but for others, it could be like, hey, we've reimagined what it means to be a sort of a citizen of the Earth, or whatever that ends up being. And again, like I said earlier, perhaps we live in a way that is almost living and breathing with the land. I don't know. I keep picturing like even like in LA, like homes that are actually like integrated with the mountain. They're not like disrupting it or something, disrupting the ecosystem. So, anyways, April of next year is definitely the time period that feels the most destructive to me. And if an astrologer doesn't work with the fixed stars, especially the royal stars of Persia, like Aldebaran, Antares, Regulus, etc., that to me is a big miss. Like, I think that astrologers should be working with the fixed stars when making predictions, because the fixed stars still signify a lot. It's sort of like the hidden layer almost behind all of this. So, anyways, so those are some of the events, but I would just say like really quickly, throughout the past few years, when people ask me like when things get better, quote unquote, I often do turn to 2032. I think it's interesting that Saturn and Uranus actually line up around that time in Gemini, actually, near another fixed star, Betelgeuse. And I think that alignment of Saturn and Uranus and Gemini can bring about a whole new society that is more, I don't know. It just feels more free to me when I think about it. When I think about those transits, I feel more free. And I think that means something, because Uranus is very, very strong in Gemini. It does deal with like innovation and leaps and bounds in new types of communication. And by 2032, people are communicating in a completely different way, well beyond the capacity of the modern day. So it could be telepathy. It could be a number of other things, but but in the greater scheme of things, right? Whether it's whether somebody believes in this idea of like a new Earth happening in 2029, along with like maybe a pole shift, or it's 2032, perhaps it's like 2029 is when people are reacting to maybe a cataclysmic event even, but like reacting to some kind of flip of the poles or some other major event that disrupts the grid. 3 years later, we do get to 2032, and it feels like we're back online. Like that's the sequence I'm feeling. And hadn't really thought about that until just now. I think there's something happening there. Like it feels like we're kind of pulling the lever down. We're turning things off. A couple years later, people come back and they're like, "Wow, I really took that too far." It's almost like by 2029. All the negative aspects of modernity, meaning like social isolation and overstimulation vis-a-vis social media and other things, all of that, it just sort of like reaches a crisis point, like I said, where it just has to change. And I think Mother Earth will force us to change. Like that to me is that there is a climate extreme event coming.
Mhm. So that is one of the things that I wanted to ask you about too. So I'm going to put it up. So in the Dolores Cannon Conversations with Nostradamus book, they put different people under hypnosis, contact Nostradamus, and one of the people is an astrologer. And so that person is given not an exact date, but planetary alignments.
Mhm.
They're shown basically the alignments, and of course, dates have changed since the time of Nostradamus, calendars have changed, and so this is, what they say a possible pole shift will happen. Before you comment on that, what's interesting is in the book, there's then a point where they use hypnotic regression actually as progression and go 100 years into the future, and that was in 1987, so they go to 2087. And in this future life, the person says that basically 2030 was when stuff went down. And then within the couple years following, there was completely new technology, new communication. There was basically communication with aliens. There was the world was one government, but kind of not in like a New World Order way, but kind of a New Earth way.
Mm.
So it's interesting, very similar to what you're saying of what you're seeing in the astrology. But I want to know what you think about this. And then also, there's this asteroid that is coming near Earth, and I can pull that up too. But first, I'll have you comment on this, and then I'll pull up the information about the asteroid, which is on April 13th, 2029, which is a little bit before this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a really interesting, you know, chart and idea because, like I said, it does feel as though there can be a disassembly and of the system at that time. But what I find interesting too is that two things: Aquarius as a sign, it does deal with the galactic. And this can include an alien race or even just like UAPs. And, the square to Saturn and Taurus could even be that there are sort of aliens or foreign entities that suddenly are inhabiting or making themselves known on the earth. But I feel that the one government idea is also really interesting too, because around that time, I could see how, again, because we're still inside of the Saturn-Pluto cycle that started in 2020, there could be these very, very hierarchical, top-down, centralized sorts of governing bodies that do exercise a lot of control. And the reason I think it could get there is because, technology, while it opens up so many conversations and opportunities, and it really does, uh, you know, open up new sources of knowledge for the masses. Technology, I think, increasingly will be used for destructive purposes by the masses, right? So, like, as technology becomes more sophisticated, it creates all these complicated problems regarding like what happens if this technology gets in the wrong hands. Like, even if to simplify it down to a drone, like drones could be awesome. You could get your food even quicker or whatever. Like, convenience is always king with technology, but obviously someone can use a drone for really messed up reasons as well. So I have a feeling just intuitively that as technology proliferates, which by the way, every time Pluto's in Aquarius, new weapons technology gets invented. And like if you even look at like even though like 3D printing wasn't invented recently, like in the last year or anything like that, like the whole thing with like Luigi Mangione, it's like he printed his weapon. So like that's an example of like weapons technology. And you know, anytime something like that happens or something is used for nefarious purposes or gets in the wrong hands, I can just hear like, okay, someone's going to either regulate something or use that as a reason to install some kind of new surveillance system. Like after 9/11, we all had to start taking like 5 to 6 steps to get through the security line at the airport and wait forever. And that's a perfect example of like a lot of people I think would be fine with that, having a TSA. A lot of people are okay with like knowing that all the other passengers have been, inspected, or their stuff has been inspected. But at the same time, there's people who, believe that it is a violation of privacy rights. So, anyways, that's obviously like a fairly, I feel like most people are on the side of probably some security checks in that case. But like for other examples, it does get a lot more wishy-washy. So like if I was to say, okay, well, TikTok could be used as a foreign, weapon or something. You could look to like Rand Paul's tweet of like, well, there's no evidence of that happening yet or at all. So like, why would we ban it? Like the TikTok ban is actually kind of emblematic of all the issues, a lot of the issues, I guess I should say, a lot of the issues we will face during Pluto and Aquarius, which is that we will have to decipher whether or not the government is actually restricting something out of our best interests or out of just control, a desire for control. And I think by the time we get to the end of this decade, and I think the astrology even, again, suggests this, there will be many disasters and reasons for the government to basically survey everything that we do. Like, let's go to LA for a second. The fires that we just had, some of which were clearly arson. How do we monitor that? Well, you could have a bunch of tiny little drone cameras that are infinitesimally small, monitoring the whole forest or monitoring all the parks all the time, because that would make it easier to figure out what happened. But then you'd also be under surveillance even more than you are now. So, those are just some of the thorny issues we'll have to figure out. But I think that by the time we reach the end of the decade, well, I'll say this too. Like, what's interesting, and I actually had this thought last night. Donald Trump's Pluto is going to be aspected very significantly by this chart that you showed me in 2029.
The pole shift.
Yes, the pole shift chart. So I don't know if that's how directly connected that would be to the pole shift, but I just want to mention that as a major event in 2029.
Yeah, and it says October 24th, 2029. For
Right.
anyone who didn't see that.
Yeah. So what's interesting about the sort of lead up, I guess, to that year, or sorry, the beginning of that year, is that, regardless of what somebody thinks about Trump or if they voted for Trump or not, astrologically, there are some transits that would suggest that at the beginning of 2029, which would be 4 years after his inauguration, by the way. So early 2029, theoretically, there's a new president taking over. There's a transition of power. The fact is that Saturn and Pluto are squaring each other at 10 degrees of Taurus and Aquarius, which are fixed signs in the same modality, same cross. And Trump's Pluto is 10 degrees of Leo, which activates that and creates a T-square, basically. So what I mean by that is that with his Pluto implicated directly by this square, which is happening in March of 2029, it's about, it's literally like his Pluto is like a degree off. So it's like very much in the orb of influence. With Trump's Pluto being involved, I don't think it's that far-fetched to imagine that the end of his second term is very it just changes the system forever as we know it. And again, I'm trying to be objective about this. Like, I don't really know if it matters, like for me, for my sake, as an astrologer trying to predict the future. I don't think it matters if I project. Like, I don't gain anything by projecting my beliefs onto a prediction, or my opinion, I should say. But I just think that like either his departure from office this time, it will either be met with just a lot of discord for various reasons, or honestly, with Pluto and Saturn squaring his natal Pluto, I mean, a third term is not impossible, and maybe that's a third term that was already instituted, agreed to by law. Basically, I think they'd have to change the Constitution. Yeah, so maybe somehow the Constitution gets changed. But
They've already, like, tried to propose it. There's, like, a senator that's trying to do that now.
Yeah.
I personally don't think that it would go through, but who knows?
Well, I think that if you were to ask a voter who, like anyone who voted for Trump, maybe I should say anyone. I shouldn't generalize, but a lot of if you ask a lot of people who voted for Trump, who do you picture on the Republican ticket in 4 years? It's in the psyche. It's embedded in the psyche. He's already there.
Right, I've heard people say that, but it's so interesting, because it's an amendment of the Constitution. I think it's a 22nd amendment that he can't. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that people have already been talking about it. I keep hearing people say stuff exactly what you're saying, and, so that's pretty interesting.
Well, yeah, it's like, I mean, when people like, I don't know, when people train to do like remote viewing and stuff, it's like, or to even like be a psychic and like read people, it's like people always talk about building a bridge to somebody. You're building a bridge to someone's energy. I think that Trump has built a bridge into our collective psyche to a point where it's hard to picture him not being on the ticket as a Republican, I guess. Like, I'm not saying that it's like, you know, fate and destiny that he would 100% be in on a third term, but it just like I just found that to be an interesting thought experiment of like just imagine who would the Republican candidate be in 4 years. It is hard to imagine. It is hard to picture like who that would be, who the substitute would be. But either way, even if it's like the Constitution is not amended, uh, I'm not saying it would be like a carbon copy of like Gen 6, but it doesn't feel like the transition would be all that easy or quiet. It would be like pretty loud. The volume would be pretty loud of like wanting representation from him again. And so, anyways, even extending a few years out, he has a Uranus return while Saturn and Mars are on his midheaven. That almost feels like to me like he's solidly in his third term, and like people are Saturn, Mars on the midheaven. People are trying to take him down. Like that.
Mhm.
That's just the energy I feel, but obviously a lot could change. Maybe he's not even the president in 3 years. So,
Mhm.
anyways, but in terms of the pole shift, to go back to that chart, and I actually
Back to that, and also this, let me put this up. This as well, which is also in 2029, which is the largest asteroid. It's like 1,000 miles long, and it's gonna be coming the closest to Earth. It's kind of like the movie Armageddon. They say that it's not gonna hit us, but, that it's gonna be closer than any asteroid ever has, and that's February 13th of 2029. So it's interesting, and then NASA has talked about this moon wobble that's gonna happen in 2030, which is basically that the moon is gonna kind of wobble on its axis in 2030, which is gonna cause massive flooding and, you know,
Mhm.
all of these destruction. So it's interesting that there's like a lot of these events that are similar timing around each other. And then we also have, the alien stuff. There's other channelers. I think like Bashar has said that like aliens are coming, like the full disclosure is going to be 2027 to 2028. So it's interesting that there's like a lot of these things converging at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, yeah. Looking at those charts, I think, yeah, and I had it actually overlaid on my own before this. I overlaid all these charts at once to kind of see, how they maybe are connected. And so, like for the asteroid event, which I have, by the way, I have April 13th of 2029. I don't know if that
Yeah.
was
April 13th,
okay.
2029. Yeah, it's
So,
Friday the 13th.
oh, right, right, exactly. Okay, so that makes it all the better. So
And
yeah.
they've named it this, like, god of chaos too. The name of it is, like, god of chaos in Greek, but then when you really look it up, it also says that it's like a serpent demon name in Greek.
Mm, yeah. Wow. That's about as dramatic as it gets. Yeah, no, I do think that April 13th of 2029 could definitely speak to some event like that because, well, because of the Saturn Pluto square. that I talked about. I mean, so Chiron is also in Taurus at that time, along with Saturn, and Chiron oftentimes is more so about like insecurities and wounds, like in the psyche and whatnot. But when I see Chiron and Taurus, I think it's very easy and to say symbolically that there is still, though, like a woundedness within the Earth itself. And Saturn and Taurus is showing that there are. I just think the Saturn-Pluto square here could be destructive in that way, in a way that affects the actual Earth, the land, and the Saturn. Again, if you just think about the Saturn Pluto semi-square that we're dealing with right now, and you look at the LA fires, the astrology is clearly showing us that any cataclysmic or destructive events that are happening during this Pluto-Saturn cycle are either like sort of like natural disasters in general, and I'm kind of like roping pandemic into that, like as a broad brush, but like it does just give me the energy of like there could be natural disasters that affect the Earth through an asteroid strike. Could definitely happen. And actually on April 13th, you do have Uranus in Gemini in a wide opposition to Mars and Sag. That's kind of wild in a way. There's something kind of sudden that actually kind of does give the energy of a sudden explosion. But if anything, that opposition happens like a week or two earlier. So maybe it would actually happen a week or two earlier. But I don't think it's far fetched to say that that is a risk. I would be surprised the asteroid actually hit Earth, but just the topic and the news story about this and the timing does, I think, fit the Saturn-Pluto square. But when it comes to the pole shift, I just want to talk about this a little bit more as well. By October of 2029, we do have the Saturn-Pluto square is pretty much done at that point. And, sorry, I have way too many grids open right now. Sorry about that. The asteroid thing, I was saying that there was a Mars Uranus opposition, but there's not. Which actually helps because I was confused as to why the opposition would have passed already. So anyways, the asteroid still, again, would be happening during the Saturn-Pluto square. But there's actually a Mercury-Saturn conjunction during the asteroid strike. I guess I should just mention that quick. That can speak to a loss of communication. So, from that vantage point, the asteroid event, even if it's, not a direct hit, I wouldn't be surprised if there's something in April of 2029 that would shut down communication or make communication more difficult around that time, actually. So, if I had done like a blind reading of April 2029 and you asked me to kind of like try to guesstimate what April 13th looks like, what's happening, I would say most likely there would be a loss of some kind of telecommunications system, even if it's temporary, for like a couple of days. Like there just would be no ability to send out a phone call in certain areas, right? It probably wouldn't be global, but that's interesting. Now, when it comes to the chart for the pole shift, which I know we kind of briefly addressed, but I didn't fully dive into the aspects and the astrology of it. The pole shift is happening actually more tightly with this Mars-Uranus opposition I alluded to for the asteroid. So the Mars-Uranus opposition is, again, fairly explosive. It does feel like with Mars and Uranus that there is a sudden ignition, a sudden explosion of something, a sudden event that we have to react to. And also, if I go to, let me just pull that up in a different software here. Also, if I look at this chart, we have Pluto still in Aquarius, but now squaring Chiron. I think that with Pluto being in Aquarius, like one of the watershed moments that I think most astrologers agree upon is that there will be some type of mass shutdown of like the power grid or just the electric grid or the internet, like something something pervasive, right? Something ubiquitous will not be accessible to us anymore. And could that be the result of a pole shift? I think that's very credible. I think that obviously you've covered this a lot. Other, people in divination and scientists as well. Like a lot of people have covered this and talked about the risk of a pole shift. And I just think the fact that Pluto is in Aquarius already makes that somewhat of a possibility. But with the Uranus Mars opposition that's happening in October of 2029, there is the possibility that international communication could also be somehow thwarted or shut down or just suddenly, because Sagittarius to me has a lot to do with like international relations, international sort of movements and shifts. So yeah, I think it's absolutely possible. But if I was constructing in a blind study, if you were like, Evan, I want you to try to guesstimate in the next few years, when would there be a pole shift? Would I pick October 2029? Probably not. But I don't think that. But like, it's one of those things where like looking at this chart, I can easily see why. But I think in a vacuum, if I was just like, able to pick whatever date I want, I don't know. It's an interesting thing how, it's interesting how it lines up. I think that in general, that Saturn-Pluto square that year, which is again early 2029 and late 2028, that feels a little bit more to me like there is some type of cataclysmic event that would actually lead to a pole shift. But again, it's in the ballpark of that.
Okay, so the last thing that I want to ask you is, so there was these remote viewers that have been looking into the future since the 70s, and there's a group of them, and they looked at 2050, and then they looked at 2060 recently. So when they started in the 70s, they were looking at 2050, and then more recently, the group has continued with new members looking at 2060. And there's also Sir Isaac Newton, like, had this theory that the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ, was going to be in 2050. And then there's also other astrologers from years ago that said that 2050, 2060 is the age of Aquarius. So we have a lot of different things about kind of this new ways of living. So like what the remote viewers saw is that there was kind of these small eco communities. There was these new types of technologies. People were kind of integrated, kind of like what you started with saying is things that you could see progressing starting in the next 10 years, where there's these new innovations, new communities, new earth type of stuff, these kind of communities. So do you have any opinions about like 2050, 2060 age of Aquarius stuff?
Yeah, and it's actually so synchronistic that it like gives me the chills. I mean, it's really fascinating because the Saturn-Pluto cycle again. Here I go with it. But the Saturn-Pluto cycle that I've been talking about from the beginning of the show, which again we are very much living inside of right now, it ends in 2054. And when you look at that cycle, the new one, that cycle is in Pisces. And not only in Pisces, but pretty close to 9 degrees of Pisces, which is squaring Aldebaran and Antares, which are these fixed stars that have many associations, by the way, but including religious wars. And in my own research, I've seen many like prominent preachers with the 9 degree the 9 degrees of the mutable signs active, because also in astrological, the astrological degree theory, each degree has an association with the zodiac sign. So the first degree is Aries degree, the 9th degree is a Sagittarian degree, and Sagittarius deals with belief and faith and religion in a lot of ways. So the Saturn-Pluto cycle, or the conjunction in the conjunction is essentially in like late 2053, early 2054. That's kind of the time range. And I actually am looking at Christmas Day of 2053. Christmas Day of 2053 is kind of interesting. Even as I'm gonna get this down to the hour. By the way, I'm gonna really try to get people excited for this. So December 25th, 2053, approximately 5 p.m. Pacific time. I feel like there's something interesting happening there that I don't want to like boil everything down to one moment or minute, but what's happening there is we have Saturn and the South Node together at 9 degrees of Pisces. Again, in a fairly solid square to Aldebaran and Taurus. I mean, again, it's about a degree off, but very close. Pluto, 12 degrees of Pisces, and the Moon, 14 degrees Cancer, which is aligned with this fixed star Sirius, and Chiron, 15 Capricorn, aligned with Vega, which is another fixed star, and Mars at 12 Sag, pretty close to Antares, squaring Pluto. So, like, even that day, interestingly, Christmas Day, 2053, feels sort of like a divine intervention of sorts, but even if it's not that day, that conjunction is a renewal. Well, maybe not even a renewal, but like some sort of new faith coming in. And it's asking people to suspend some kind of disbelief, I think. And to speak to your question about the age of Aquarius, it does dovetail with this time period that we're talking about because in the conception of the astrological ages and the precession of the equinoxes, or precession of the equinox, that is founded on this idea that's scientifically backed, obviously, which is that the Earth wobbles as it spins and as it orbits around the sun. There's a third variable, which is that the Earth is not spinning perfectly. It's sort of like, it's like at the end of that movie Inception, you're just not sure where it's going. So the Earth has a slight wobble, and that wobble takes 26,000 years to kind of fully, work its way around. And so if you divide 26,000 years by 12 zodiac signs, each astrological age is about 2,150 years. I mean, give or take, 2,166 years. So the predominant theory is that the age of Pisces began in 0 AD. Although I think that can easily be disputed. I mean, you could argue it's a little bit earlier than that, but around the time of Christ. And the age of Pisces has everything to do with religion and the idea of sacrifice through the lens of Christianity, especially. So Christ dying for our sins, that's like the ultimate Piscean idea. But the ages overlap. So astrologers do not agree on when the age of Aquarius actually begins, even though I've kind of chopped it up very simplistically. It's just basic math, but like you can find ample evidence that the age of Aquarius already started. And I could easily find that. I mean, you could go back to 1960 when there, or I think it was 60 or 61, but in the early 60s, there was an Aquarius stellium, like a crazy Aquarius, like a crazy lineup of planets in the sign of Aquarius. I actually just quickly want to find that year. I think it was, I think it might have been 1961. It couldn't have been 1960. Yeah. So 1962. Okay. Early 1962, we had like the vast majority of the planets and celestial bodies in Aquarius. And, 1962, John F. Kennedy was president. We started to, in the 60s, experience like, technology in a different way, the television, there was like mass media, like really flourishing and starting to flourish. Anyways, I would argue, and many other astrologers would argue, that in the early 60s, kind of with that lineup even in Aquarius, we just started to peek into the age of Aquarius. But the ages are like waves. They happen simultaneously as they transition. So Pluto in Aquarius is another complicating factor, right? Like people will see astrologers like me talk about Pluto in Aquarius. They assume, therefore, must be the age of Aquarius. But that is also a misconception. Pluto, was in Aquarius a quarter century ago. That was not the age of Aquarius. So it is, though, giving us flashes, I think, of the age of Aquarius because of its proximity, official proximity. So if you do the math and you approximately set the age of Pisces to 0 AD, technically you're looking at like 2150 or something. But I don't think that is either, like, that is also not, to me, like, that's also like too far into the other extreme to say that we're not going to witness, which we already are witnessing, right? Like the age of it, like we're witnessing disclosure. We're witnessing like rapid advancements in communication technology. We are literally witnessing millions of people go through like a spiritual upgrade at the same time. Like I didn't even know what astrology was 5 years ago, right? And that is emblematic of this Aquarian age. Like people can kind of like Neo in the Matrix, they can download information like overnight. And obviously, I'm sure you have experiences like that as well, where you suddenly just like tapped into some kind of insight and it led to, went from A to Z. So anyways, I feel like this is a great way to kind of like loop everything together that we've talked about, because I want to remind people that like the Saturn-Pluto cycle that we're living in right now, that started in 2020, is very tyrannical. It's not like nothing happens easily, right? These transitions, it's almost like, the greater the darkness, the greater the light kind of thing. So we are responding to, there's a sense of urgency, right? That comes through, that comes up when power becomes so overwhelming. And when we push back or we find alternative solutions or communities, like there is a generative process going on. It's not just destructive. Astrology is the study of duality in a lot of ways. And so as we witness these Saturn-Pluto squares, Saturn-Pluto oppositions or whatever, it's like, okay, but there's on the other side of that, there's like an equal force operating. So I think that we are responding to stress and destruction right now with light and enlightenment. And that will take time, though. Like the 2053, 2054 conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, that does feel like an entirely new faith-based system or a whole new religious movement. I really could see that in that, because Pisces does deal with religion as well. But I don't want people to think, obviously, they have to wait that long. The future is here now. And I think that the Saturn Uranus conjunction in 2032, that's what I'm hooking most of my hope to, actually. It's that conjunction, because Saturn is structure, Uranus is an innovation. When they come together, they can come up with new, really exciting new ideas. Like the previous one in the late 80s, the internet was commercialized not much longer after that. And technology was obviously like running, pretty well at that time and advancing rapidly. So yeah, I think there's plenty of credence to, or plenty of credibility to that idea that by the 2050s, maybe it is contact with an extraterrestrial or some other divine, like a being that seems divine, but maybe it's just from another planet. Like it could be that scenario.
Or another dimension.
Exactly. Or another dimension. Right. It could definitely surprise us. And I think, that's the other thing, what we talk about a lot with the Earth split, is that these phenomena might only be visible to people who are actually, working in those dimensions. We're actually meditating and actually, well, I know you run a lot of mass meditations, which is great. And you did one for the LA fires, which is awesome. And, I think we'll have a lot more, a lot more movements like that. And again, what are we doing exactly? I think that we are all subconsciously responding to the sort of lack of a legitimate authority figure. Like Saturn in or the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn feels like the chaperones are no longer there. You know, the parental figures have left the building. And I certainly felt that way, you know, during the lockdowns. I felt like I felt like it just became much harder for me to trust any kind of directive. And in a lot of ways that did inspire me to pursue this. You know, like
Mhm.
think it's like it's almost like when we are the most imprisoned by the ideas of others that we decide to free our minds.
Right, and that's like the most change comes from the hard times. It's like the concept of the seed, you know, like the seed has to completely crack open for it to grow into this amazing tree, and that takes time. So, Evan, thank you so much for being here, for being my first guest, for all of this awesome insight, and I know that you are fully booked out for the rest of the year and probably already going to be start getting booked out for 2026. But tell people about what you have on Substack, your podcast, your YouTube, other offerings and things that you have that are not your one-on-ones.
Yeah. So yeah, one-on-ones are sold out. But my newsletter, my Substack is a great place to just get like a lot of in-depth horoscopes, predictions, especially like guides for manifesting on the new moon and for releasing on the full moon. Also my YouTube, I post a lot of monthly predictions there. And I still have also 2025 prediction videos for each zodiac sign that people can download through my website, and those have been I think very useful for people who want to just plan out their year. And you know, it's still early enough in the year where I think people would want to download it. So yeah, so and then of course I'm on the other social platforms, not Red Note, but you know, plenty of other. So
Well, Evan, thank you for being here. And I am excited to see what this all unfolds into over the rest of the decade.
yeah, it should be well, impossible to forget. So I don't know. I think we're all I think I'm hopeful, right, with the ability to at least share and connect like this. So yeah.
Thanks for listening to the first episode of Ultra Minds with JK Ultra, where I'm going to be interviewing the greatest minds in spirituality, consciousness, astrology, esoteric wisdom, hidden knowledge, conspiracies, aliens, hypnosis, channelers, and so much more. So make sure you like and subscribe. And if you are more interested in hearing what I have to say about these topics, then you can tune in on the Tuesday Night Live every Tuesday here on YouTube at 6 p.m. Pacific, where we go into a deep dive about all of these topics and also answer live questions in the chat. So make sure you tune into that if you want to hear what I have to say, but tune into Ultra Minds, where I really get to highlight the expertise of the experts. Stay tuned.